Know the difference with Annex Wealth Management, a team segment with Keith Butler, Wealth Manager at Annex Wealth Management. Keith, welcome back.
Oh, great to be here, Danny.
Some of my best learning happens when I make mistakes, and there are plenty. I spotted an article titled The Biggest Money Mistakes by Decade, and it was about decisions we make or don't make during each decade of life. Keith, you've worked with a lot of clients. You've seen a lot of their behavior. Right. Let's talk about each phase of those lives and see if we can find some way to avoid the mistakes. And we're going to flip it around to the positive, talk about how to properly handle these phases. And the first one, and I guess this is really more on parents, we can blame our parents on this one, happens during childhood, and that's when we miss opportunities to educate.
Yeah, I think a lot of emphasis these days is on financial literacy, and that can't start too early. I remember when I was a little kid, I just said, well, what do you mean you can't afford it? Just write a check. 8 years old or something, that you don't know how it works. And teaching kids how it works, I think, is probably the biggest thing you can do, early on in life. And as you get into your teens, when all of a sudden you may start to get a job and get your own checking account, but how does all of that work? You need to have the money to pay the credit card. All these things which seem obvious after years and years of doing this aren't necessarily obvious at that age.
Let's move to the 20s, and this is interesting because we were talking off air about one of the suggestions, and it was choose a major with ROI, return on investment. You aren't on board with that.
I'm not. I think that there's been some notion, some movement, for lack of a better word, over time to equate colleges with trade schools. I think there's a real value to a college education. And to take a little bit of a step back, and this, I guess, really has to start in the teens, not the 20s, as you're making this decision. Do more people than necessary go to college? And it's probably true. There are a lot of people who go to college that probably aren't that interested in it, and maybe they think, I'm supposed to do it, those are my expectations. But I think there has to be a real, honest reckoning with what are your talents, what are your interests. But for folks that can benefit from a college education, are interested in it, I think they pay dividends down the road that you can't really measure in dollars and cents. I'm not necessarily agreeing with the notion that you need to look at college as something where you get a return on the investment. If it's strictly a trade type school, then yes, of course. And also, as far as the debt coming out, that is something that also has to be reckoned with, and that may feed into the decision of where you go to college.
I know people in their 50s that are still carrying student debt.
Yeah.
That's a rough one. Talking about addressing money mistakes we make by decades, we're now into our 30s, and we're talking about misplaced spending. Fancy cars, boats, toys, vacations, that's fine, but you got to take care of the important stuff first.
Exactly. And this is where I'm going to take a little bit of a step back of why we're having this discussion altogether. Is we work with a lot of people. We work with high net worth folks, but we also work with ordinary people, if you will. I meet with these folks all the time when they're getting ready to do their financial plan. Can we retire? That's the big question, Danny. Can we retire? And when the answer is yes, and they're thrilled, and I'm thrilled to be able to show this to them, is because they were setting themselves up decades in advance. And that's kind of the basis of this entire discussion. So when you get to the 30s, that's when it starts. Now, when we meet with some people that are in their 30s, doing their financial plan can get really speculative because you're talking about, geez, what are you going to get in Social Security? Are you going to have a pension? Well, truthfully, they'll probably change jobs a couple of times. You'll have some great things happen in your life. You'll have some challenges in your life between now and then. But it's starting to get that discipline, and that, I think, can really start in earnest. Even though you start in the beginning, in the 20s, as you mentioned, the 30s is when you really start to do that. Start to think ahead about, okay, let's get some discipline with our 401k plan, with our saving and our investing.
Let's roll into the 40s because it's kind of sort of the same story. Not enough saving and investing. And it's hard for a lot because your family is growing probably and there's lots of things to pay for.
Exactly. And the 40s are kind of the tweeners because in the 30s, it's incredibly speculative. On the 50s, you can see it. And in the 40s, that's that transition period between where retirement is this bizarre concept for old people to, oh, wow, I need to start thinking about this. And it is a lot of the same issues as in the 30s. Your kids are getting older, they're getting more expensive, and then you kind of have to balance all of that with a good financial plan and a realistic view of how much you can be spending.
Talking about addressing money mistakes we make by decades with Keith Butler, a wealth manager at Annex Wealth Management. Into the 50s, too much for the kids, not enough for you.
Yeah, right? There you go. And that is when you should really start the plan in earnest because it's not as completely speculative. Now you have a better idea because if you've been doing these right things in your 30s and 40s, now you're starting to get a little bit of accumulation because 30s it might be, Jesus, just X dollars. That's not very much. No, but it multiplies, and it multiplies. And then when you're 50s, you're like, oh my goodness, this is turning into something. So this is when you have to start weaning your kids off the dole, so to speak, if you possibly can. Again, everybody's circumstances are different, and if you're doing the right things for them, then now they're getting into their, and all the things we were talking about before of your mistakes, those are the things, the good advice that you should be imparting to them.
Into the 60s, when the finish line is kind of in view, retirement planning fails, maybe not even planning at all.
Right. As I mentioned earlier, and we've talked about many times, the plan is all these things coming together. It's income, it's spending habits, it's the nature of your savings. So you want to make sure this is when you start thinking about risk management, okay? Because you can be very aggressive, when you're younger, because you have a long time frame. Again, if you're doing things right, and unless, life throws you some bad curveballs, you're not going to be relying on those savings right then and there, and you can invest more aggressively because downturns like we've had this year, you can withstand and come out just fine.
And then 70s and beyond, you can't outrun inflation or debt.
Right. Again, always be looking at your risk tolerance, and maybe you're dialing back the risk, especially if you have a plan that looks successful on paper, is successful. You don't necessarily need to run up the score. And at that point in time, you don't necessarily need to take the risk.
Keith, bottom line, get with Annex Wealth Management. No matter where you are on the journey, we can guide you to avoid some of these mistakes and get you pointed in the right direction. For investment, retirement planning, tax planning, estate planning, know the difference. Website, annexwealth.com. Click that Get Started button. Start the wealth metric process. Keith Butler, Wealth Manager, Annex Wealth Management. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome, Danny.